Hello and welcome to Roundtable. A man who describes himself as a provincial oaf may spell trouble for the two front-runners in the French presidential election 9 months from now. His name is Xavier Bertrand, and both Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen have reasons to be worried after a surprise victory in a recent regional election that could see him as a serious candidate next April. Good to have you along. I'm David Foster. Marine Le Pen's national rally was so badly beaten that her own father, once the leader of the far right himself, launched a scathing attack on his daughter's leadership. So who is Bertrand? And is the race to the Élysée Palace now wide open? The recent victory of the centre-right Xavier Bertrand over the far right in regional elections has shaken up the French political landscape. Many expected the 2022 presidential election to be a contest simply between the incumbent Emmanuel Macron and the far-right's Marine Le Pen. Bertrand himself and many others across France now say it is a three-horse race for the presidency. Bertrand's victory is being hailed as the comeback of the centre-right on the national political scene. If he runs, he might just capture votes from and nullify the far right. But Le Pen was recently re-elected leader of her party, the National Rally, and is forging on with plans to regain lost votes from French conservative voters. Will Bertrand's success be short-lived, or does he have a real chance of winning next year's elections? We'll go first to Marseille in southern France, welcoming back Dr. Joseph Downing, an expert in French politics and security at the LSE. From Paris, we're rejoined by the French journalist and political commentator Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. And in London, we see Professor Philippe Marliere, Director of European and International Social and Political Studies at the University College London. So we have an Englishman in France, a Frenchman in England. So I'm going to start with the only geographically authentic amongst you, that is you, Anne-Elisabeth, and we'll go into Xavier Bertrand's character. Former insurance salesman, describes himself as a provincial oaf. He likes to play up his ordinariness, yes?
He does, and he also likes to play the fact that almost alone among the candidates, except for Marine Le Pen, he did not graduate from ENA, the technocratic elite school, which has just had its name changed by Emmanuel Macron. And so he is trying to identify as somebody who's reasonable, closer to the people, not in Paris, and a kind of safe pair of hands. He used to be a health and social affairs minister in the Sarkozy government, where he was actually appreciated there, and he's playing up all of this.
I think, Joseph, you describe him as rather uninspiring. So the question is, what's the attraction?
Well, that precisely at the moment, I think, is the attraction, right? We've had COVID, which has disrupted the social and political and economic order no end. But prior to that, it's important to appreciate the context of France with the Yellow Vest protests and protests against Emmanuel Macron's pension reforms. I think the French, for a change, want somebody who's actually pretty average, a safe pair of hands, and isn't going to do anything too radical.
Philippe, I think you believe he has got a chance when it comes to next year's elections.
I think he probably has a chance by default, given that the other main candidates are quite unpopular, I should say, starting with the incumbent president. But also Le Pen herself is not that popular when you look at opinion polls. I should add to what the two other guests have said, and I quite agree with what they've said overall, but that he's a sort of born-again new politician because, in fact, he's a very seasoned politician. I think his career started over 20 years ago, and he was 2 or 3 times, I believe, a minister in several cabinets and under several presidents, starting with Chirac 15 years ago or so, then Sarkozy. And to finish, I think until 2017, he was very much involved into the main conservative party, Les Républicains, being the organizer of François Fillon's campaign for the presidential election. And he left the party shortly after. And I think that's probably one of the most interesting things he's done lately. It's a bit of a gamble, but I think he's gambling on the increasing unpopularity of political parties in France. He wants to go it alone, and that's probably his best asset for the time being.
Let's hear from the man himself, first with a couple of things I'm going to read out. National Front stopped, made it retreat sharply. This is now a three-horse race, broken the jaws of the National Front, their demagoguery, their sterile proposals, their intolerance. And this was the message to the French people.
I want to speak directly to the France that we refuse to see, that we refuse to hear, and that abstained on these two Sundays. It's the emotional cry of France that works every day but can no longer make ends meet. It's the cry of France that always asks to make a bigger effort, but that receives only contempt or indifference in return. It's the cry of France that respects rules, yet sees that everywhere the law is trampled with impunity.
So, Anne-Elisabeth, he says the cry of a France, people he feels have been ignored.
I think he's in many ways right. I also think that he's really playing up to the hilt that sort of separateness from what everybody practically except Macron is sort of damning in this election run, which is the elites. So he's saying, no, I speak for the common man. And it might work. It still is slightly uninspiring. It's also I would slightly disagree with Philippe Marliere in that in one way, yes, he has created his own party, but mostly he created his own party because he didn't want to be subjected to the various obligations, including a primary in the Républicain Party. But I think people at large almost do not know about his having a different party. They see him as somebody whose career was with Les Républicains and the UDF before what the party was called. But again, there's annoyance about Macron. There's annoyance about Macron in the way that he handled the COVID crisis. There's, of course, the memory of the Gilets jaunes, and that's the other thing that Xavier Bertrand is talking about in here. He is reminding people that they were revolting almost and up to the point when COVID overtook the entire situation in the country, and that he would not have waited so long to listen to those people. That's the subtext.
I know, Joseph, he has been a minister, but to some extent he's coming out of the shadows. And I would point out that something similar happened with Emmanuel Macron. He'd never stood for elected office before he became president. He only got 23% in the first round. And it's only taken 5 years for him to become this derided figure. So do you think there might be a danger that the people would turn around and say, well, hang on, we don't know very much about Bertrand, and look what happened when we didn't know very much about Macron?
I mean, I think possibly in quote-unquote normal times, right, that might hold true. But given the absolute shock people have been through, given the kind of continuing rumblings on of the terror threat in France under Emmanuel Macron, anxieties about COVID recovery, I don't think that will play as much of a large part, especially given that the other two candidates in the election are just so deeply unpopular. I think that really is his biggest asset, unless there's some hidden, Me Too type of affair or some financial irregularities that come out about Bertrand. I honestly think it's his election to lose at this point. I think if he just plays it safe, he's in with a really good shot.
OK, so he's the least worst option, would be one way, perhaps, of putting it. What are his policies, Philippe? Where does he stand?
I think overall he is a fairly mainstream conservative man, although he is now the president, or he's been for a while, the president of the Provence region and formerly a bastion of French socialism and of the left. He's no left-wing or no left-winger. I think he likes to portray himself as a kind of social Gaullist. That's the sort of says, but so was François Fillon, and François Fillon's program for the presidential election in 2017 wasn't particularly Gaullist or left-wing Gaullism. I think he's mainstream conservative. In economic terms, he would sort of probably go along to a very large extent with what Macron's trying to do in terms of, reforms, pensions, for instance. He would certainly approve of that. When it comes to societal issues, I think, for instance, he took a stand on the against same-sex marriage, wedding, and that's what I would really position him more to the right wing of the Conservative Party.
So, Anne-Elisabeth, he's being portrayed as a rather ordinary person, very, very conservative, the least worst option. He doesn't sound like the great disruptor, really, does he?
He doesn't. The real problem is that all I hear from, usual conservative voters in France, and they say that they do not see any difference in his platform from the moderate socialists, and they're not interested. And what they're expressing more and more forcefully after each election is the fact that they say we are a party on the centre right. We would like to have centre right or right wing candidates to vote for, and many of them are really sort of adamant about this. I don't know how much this can sort of withstand the testing times when we get to the election, and I don't think that Marine Le Pen attracts many of these people, but it still means that he is actually gathering less of a consensus inside his own family that he might be outside his family.
Joseph, take us through the mechanics of a French election here. I read out the figures for last time. Macron 23%, Le Pen 21%. 44% between them, and other candidates therefore had to drop out. If it happens again this time that there are three main candidates, and there will be others as well, more than likely, who is Bertrand most likely to squeeze in that first round? Would it be Macron? Would it be Le Pen?
I think he's most likely to knock out Le Pen, actually, in this case. I mean, I was quite worried about the possibility of Le Pen making it to the second round of the presidential election, and possibly even sneaking a win if she came up against, again, the hugely unpopular Macron. But if you look at Bertrand, he's co-opting some of Le Pen and some of the Front National's sort of traditional ground, right? Like, he's made very strong statements about the so-called political Islam problem in France, that Macron's been too soft on radical Islamism. He's advanced a sort of platform of increased kind of security responses to questions of terrorism and Islam in France. He bangs the drum for more kind of assimilation and integration. So I think he actually could take, it could end up being him and Macron in the second round.
So let's use this opportunity now to talk about Marine Le Pen, and we'll go back to her nemesis, if you like, her dad, Jean-Marie Le Pen, founder of the National Front. He doesn't see eye to eye with his daughter, and he had this to say: either Marine Le Pen goes back to the basics on immigration and insecurity with resumption of virility and clear positions, or the party will face disappearance. Either Marine Le Pen finds the tone of previous fights, or else she will gradually fade. Well, she had this to say in reply.
We will not go back. With all due respect to our own history, we will not go back to the National Front. We must, now more than ever, move to the next step, making our compatriots share our vision for the future and making our propositions known to them.
So my question to you, Anne-Elisabeth, is she deliberately taking her party to the middle, or is there any possibility that she's been misunderstood, or might she realise if she's done it, it's a mistake, and go back to the far right, even though she says she won't?
No, she is definitely taking her party as much to the middle as she thinks she can go. She wants to be elected. She also feels that the only way for her to win is to appeal to some of the right's candidates who are going to be disappointed with another candidate, such as Bertrand. And that's why Bertrand was saying those things about Islam that he hadn't until now. That's sort of very new for him. And also, I mean, she has this incredibly Oedipal relationship with her father. She kicked him out of the party in 2015. He has been sort of sniping at her ever since. And she's now stuck between a rock and a hard place. The rock is her father, who says this is not what I used to found, what I founded half a century ago, which was le Front National, and this is no longer what it should be to keep its soul. And on the other side, you've got the mysterious candidate Éric Zemmour, who now is sort of making a run for the presidency. Nobody knows how far that will go. He's a famous and successful polemicist of the hard right, and the teams of Marine Le Pen's niece, the granddaughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marion Le Pen, are now helping Zemmour, and that's a really interesting development. So Marine Le Pen is stuck between her niece and her father, and that's an uncomfortable position to be, considering that she's leading a party which is basically a family concern. That is really what's new in this election.
Okay, well, we'll talk about, Joseph seems to think that she might be the one squeezed out if it comes to the presidential election by Bertrand. So, Philippe, let me ask you this. In fact, this is for all of you. I'm listening to you posit the cases of the possible candidates for the French presidential election. I do not see a single sentiment that follows the idea of liberal values. Has that gone away in France, Philippe?
I think the person upholding liberal values was elected in 2017, i.e. Macron. But I think on that ground, it disappointed a lot of the sort of center-left and center-right voters who are now wondering whether Macron was indeed a true liberal, because I think on a number of issues, including law and order, notably, he has shifted to the right. So
he's trying to steal Marine Le Pen's clothes, if you'll pardon the expression.
Absolutely, and that's why, our today's topic, Xavier Bertrand, I think is best bet, I suppose, is try to gather together the conservative family and voters, which traditionally until Sarkozy were, voting for a sort of mainstream, fair conservative candidate. And I think that kind of electorate weighs about 25 to 30% of the electorate. So I'm not saying he's going to get that, far from it. But I think there's certainly, if you like, a constituency for him to hope to make it to the second round. I think a point which is worth noting is that nowadays you make it to the second round by gaining between 17, 18 to 24%. I think that's a very low score, if you like, in terms of votes cast by the electorate. So I think anything can happen. Let's remember in 2017, between Marine Le Pen, who came second, and the fourth candidate from the radical left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, there were only over 500,000 votes, which, considering the size of the French electorate, is very small.
Okay, so I'm wondering if anything could actually happen. There are any number of possibilities, Joseph, because let's say Macron is knocked out. Where do the votes from the liberal left, who may have felt betrayed by him, where do those votes go to? So could we perhaps see somebody with more liberal leanings who isn't Macron? Could we see the conservative Bertrand in there, or are we going to see the centre-right Marine Le Pen? Are all options open?
This is something that's really interesting, and something we haven't discussed yet is abstention rates. So Macron, the vote between Le Pen and Macron last time in the second round of the French election in 2017 had historic highs of voter abstention in the second round. We've seen in local elections recently extremely high levels of voter abstention, and I think this is going to play a very important role in this possible election. And the other thing we haven't discussed, which is really important, considering last presidential election, is the prospect of election meddling. So if we remember the Macron leaks attack, where through a phishing attack, hackers got access to a range of Macron's emails and tried to create a sentiment of uncertainty in the last 48 hours where the media were not allowed to comment on the election. Really anything can happen here. And I think these are two things that may play really important roles in this upcoming vote.
Let us not get ahead of ourselves, because Bertrand's just done particularly well in regional elections, and local elections, if you like, are often won or lost on your policies, on your points of view, whereas the bigger national ones are sometimes a bit more about personality. So who's got the personality, Anne-Elisabeth, here to make it to the Élysée Palace?
That's a really interesting question, because they're not, pretty predictable. And the one thing that Bertrand has actually in his favor is that he basically self-declared the evening of the regional election. And you're quite right to say that the regional election is very different from a national election, even from the European election, which is also a national election in France. And there was this huge premium to incumbents, and Bertrand decided to seize the day. But I don't see many of the candidates actually sort of being sort of, any of them is sort of going to create enthusiasm for the masses, which really means that there could be surprises. I mean, I look at them all, and they're all tremendously boring, and we've all seen them before, except possibly, Zemmour on the right, and possibly some mysterious candidate on the left that might crop up. But the time is short now.
But boring is safe sometimes, Philippe.
I think so, because I was thinking of a very lively and candidate with lots of charisma on the radical left, i.e. Jean-Luc Mélenchon. But, there's no point in being charismatic if you put off, a majority of the electorate, which seems to be the case concerning Mélenchon. So, yes, I quite agree with the members of the panel here that, on the whole, those who are best placed to make it to the second round and win that election seem to have, on the whole, kind of bit of a dull, predictable profile, not very exciting, if you like. But that seems to be the sort of new age, of politics in general. The age of very exciting politicians seems to be over, at least about France. But it seems a paradox, because on the other hand, that election more than ever will be about people, persons, rather than parties or programs. And I think you might argue that Charles de Gaulle, who founded that election and that constitution of the Fifth Republic in 1958, probably wanted that to some extent. But before, in the past, we used to have parties, fielding candidates with a program backing them. It's no longer the case. Now we've got the new season where you have people, and it could be virtually anyone declaring that their candidacy for that election. And I think we mentioned the case of Zemmour. Zemmour is a journalist. He's not a full-time politician, yet he wants to run on yet another far-right platform. So there's a lot of people on the far right, and that's very weird. So that's why it makes that election very volatile, very unpredictable.
Let's take a look at the picture behind me, and we see him with a big smile on his face. No wonder he's quite excited about what's going on, and we see apprehension, if you like, on Le Pen and Macron's faces. My question to you, Joseph, and this is for all of you as well, what does this man, Xavier Bertrand, have to do to keep the momentum now?
I would say he just needs to keep his head down and not have any major catastrophes. I mean, we should remember that in 2017, the favourite going into the election was Francois Fillon, until the fake job scandal and his financial irregularities came to light. He was the clear shoe-in favourite and could possibly have even beaten Macron in the second round had his campaign gone better. And I think if Bertrand just sticks to the script and doesn't have any, massive disclosures of indiscreet behaviour, financially or morally in any way, I think it's his to lose, really.
Well, I don't know about moral disclosure in France. We're always told it doesn't figure in politicians' lives. But I'm wondering, Anne-Elisabeth, whether there'll be those out there who are trying to dig up something on him.
First of all, he's been in politics long enough that if there were something about him, at the very least, it would be whispered about Paris. And I hear about other candidates, but I don't hear about him. The other thing is that at the end of the day, what's going to make the difference in France, considering that next year we're going to sort of feel the economic bite of the outpouring of money that was thrown at the COVID crisis in order for the economy to keep churning. And in that case, the French might be in desiring sort of somebody who would both feel populist to them and be a safe pair of hands. And the thing about French populism, each European nation does populism in the way that's different. And the French populists, what they want is they want statism that works. They want what we call les 30 glorieuses, which are the 3 decades after the end of the war when France was reconstructing with growth of 5% a year, a good welfare net, and no unemployment. And that's really what they want, the status. They do not want something adventurous. And what Macron tried to sell them, the startup nation, they don't really believe in it. And also, they both do not believe in it, and they also have this vague feeling that that sort of thing, that's hazardous, and it's not started by the government. And Macron was a kind of hazardous statist, which was something that was sort of completely uncongenial to the French, which is probably going to not help him this time round.
Philippe, do you think that this time next year we could be saying bonjour, Monsieur le Président Bertrand?
Yes, of course. Possibly. I think that the great question mark in French politics today is Macron's standing. What kind of support is he enjoying now amongst French voters at large? Also, let's take into account that we are still a year away from that election, and in a year time is an eternity in politics. A lot of things could happen. Not simply scandals being revealed by the media, but also candidates deciding to run, people we haven't heard of yet. It's very, very hard to tell. The right wing, the conservatives are going to have a primary election to choose their own candidate. Bertrand said he wouldn't take part in it, although he's invited to join. So there's going to be a lot of candidates. That's also part of the difficulty in deciding who are the best placed candidates, because it's going to be
it is all up in the air at the moment, but we've had you three, thank you very much indeed, to colour some of the characters and to tell us where you think it's going. Joseph Darling, thank you very much indeed. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet and Philippe Marliere, we thank you very much indeed. We thank you for watching this edition of Round Table, April 2022. Seulement 9 mois. Au revoir.